Dave is standing at a pharmacy counter. He's 65. There are 3 prescriptions in his hand and only enough money for 2. He's not choosing based on which one matters least. He's choosing based on which one he can survive without this month. 40 years ago, Dave wasn't in this position. Nobody is at 25. At 25, Dave had the exact same salary as 2 other guys his age. $60,000 a year, same city, same commute, same Monday mornings. On paper, their lives were identical. What separated them in the end wasn't luck. It wasn't a lawsuit, an inheritance, or a lucky bet on some stock. It was smaller than that, smaller than almost anything you'd think to measure. It was $8, repeated or not repeated, every single morning for 4 decades. Let's go back to the beginning and watch it happen. 3 guys, call them Alex, Dave, and Julian, all 25, all working entry-level jobs at the same salary, all standing at the same kind of counter every morning, deciding what to do with the same $8. Alex does something almost nobody does. He automates it. Before he can talk himself out of it, before the smell of the espresso machine gets a vote, $8 leaves his account and lands in an index fund. Every day, no exceptions, no debate. Dave spends his. Coffee, a subscription, whatever gives him a small lift to start the day. Completely normal. Most people live exactly like Dave. Julian tells himself he'll start soon. Not today. Today's tight. Maybe once the next raise comes through. For now, his mornings look just like Dave's. A year goes by. Alex checks his account. It's grown to a little over $3,000, enough that you can start to see the shape of the machine underneath it. $8 a day works out to roughly $240 a month, sitting in a plain tax-advantaged account invested in an S&P 500 index fund, assumed to grow around 8% a year on average, which, worth saying clearly, is close to the market's long-term historical pace, not a promise about any single year. Dave and Julian, meanwhile, are sitting at 0. To most people watching from the outside, Alex looks like he's losing. $3,000 doesn't buy a car. It barely covers a security deposit, and he gave up 365 small moments of enjoyment to get there. Dave and Julian tease him for it, living like he's saving for a war that isn't coming. They might even have a point in one narrow sense. Skipping the coffee counter probably cost Alex a little bit of casual networking too, the kind that happens over small talk and shared lines. Here's roughly how you'd price that. Say he misses about 150 of those casual conversations a year, and only a small sliver of them, maybe 1 in 200, ever turns into an actual lead, and only a fraction of those leads ever turns into a real raise worth something like $6,000. Run the odds through, and it nets out to about $90 a year in expected value. That's not a real number Alex ever sees on a statement. It's a rough estimate of what he's given up. And set next to the $3,000 he's already built, it's about 3% of the total. It barely registers. What does register quietly is the first crack forming in Dave's life. Dave's car needs a new alternator, not a catastrophe, just normal, unglamorous life. Except Dave has nothing set aside, so the bill pushes his account negative, and the bank, which has no opinion about whether Dave is a good person, charges him a $35 overdraft fee. Then it happens again, then a third time. Dave doesn't end that year at 0. He ends it at negative $105. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly. The financial system charges you specifically for not having money. Before anything dramatic even happens, no crash, no layoff, nothing newsworthy. The penalty for having no cushion has already started quietly working against him. $35 was just the entry fee. The real bill arrives with the recession. 5 years pass. All 3 are 30 now. And the economy turns cold. A genuine 20% market downturn. The kind that dominates headlines for months. Alex had built his account to around $18,000. The crash takes it down to about $14,400. That's not a number that quietly disappears from the story later. It stays part of his balance for the rest of his life, exactly the way a real loss would. For a moment, this looks like proof that Julian was right to wait. 5 years of Alex's discipline, and his reward is a 5-figure paper loss. Julian, holding nothing but cash, feels vindicated. He's measuring the wrong thing, though, because in that same downturn, Dave gets a $5,000 medical bill. With no savings, it goes on a credit card at 24% interest, paid down at $150 a month. the only amount he can manage. Here's what that actually does. Each month, the remaining balance grows by 2% in interest. That's 24% split across 12 months, and then shrinks by whatever's left of his $150 payment after that interest is covered. Run that cycle forward month after month, and it takes 56 of them, almost 5 years, to clear a single hospital visit. Add up all that interest along the way, and it comes to roughly $3,300. The bank has effectively reached into Dave's future and taken 3 years of his labor for something that already happened. Then the recession reaches into the office itself. Management calls a meeting. Everyone takes a temporary 10% pay cut starting immediately. Dave and Julian, living paycheck to paycheck, have no room to object. A 10% cut on $60,000 is $6,000 a year, and assuming it takes 2 years for pay to recover, that's $12,000 in wages neither of them will ever see again. That's the real cost of having no leverage, not a metaphor, an actual number. Alex looks at his own bruised account. $14,400 isn't glamorous, but it's real runway. And because he'd spent the last 5 years building relationships elsewhere instead of at the coffee counter, he already has another offer on the table. Same salary, different company. He declines the pay cut, and he leaves. Worth asking yourself, honestly, if your income got cut 10% tomorrow, could you walk out the door the next day? If the answer's no, you're not really working for a salary at that point. You're working for survival, and there's a difference. Alex already walked out one door. 5 years later, his money starts walking on its own. 10 years in, at 35, something changes in the math itself. Alex's balance sits around $39,450. Look at just this 1 year in isolation. He put in about $2,900 from his own paycheck, and the market generated almost exactly that same amount on its own without him doing anything. For the first time, his money is contributing as much as he is. 2 years later, at 37, his balance is near $52,600, and the market's own contribution that year, close to $3,900, now outpaces what he's putting in himself. His money has effectively taken on a second job. Julian, at 35, looks at his own account and sees zero. The plan to start later has quietly become never. Panic sets in, and he decides to make up for lost time by doubling his contribution. $16 a day now, close to $5,800 a year. But a decade of 3% inflation means rent and groceries now cost roughly a third more than they did at 25. So that extra money isn't spare cash he's redirecting. It's a real strain on his budget. When a $3,000 certification comes up that would guarantee him a 15% raise, Julian can't afford it. His money is tied up trying to catch up. He misses the promotion, and his career stalls right there. Dave, meanwhile, has spent a decade paying down debt and missing payments, and his credit score has fallen into subprime territory, somewhere around 580 against Alex's 780. That gap isn't abstract, and it isn't one fee. It's a stack of smaller ones. In a lot of markets, that score difference alone adds roughly $1,500 a year in higher car insurance. On top of that, landlords ask him for an extra month's rent as a deposit whenever he moves. Money that just sits there instead of earning anything, which works out to something like another $160 a year in lost investment growth. Add those together, and Dave is paying somewhere around $1,600 a year, every year, simply for looking risky on paper. It's not a penalty for recklessness. It's a penalty for the profile, whether or not that profile is a fair reflection of who he actually is. That profile won't reset in a decade. Almost everything else will. 10 more years pass. All three are 45 now. 20 years into this, exactly halfway to the finish line. Alex's account sits at about $132,400. This year alone, the market added roughly $10,000 in growth, more than 3 times what he actually contributed from his paycheck. The gap between saving money and being paid by your own money isn't subtle anymore. Julian, 10 years into his catch-up plan, has built his own account to about $89,600. Real progress. Doubling down did help. But here's the number that actually matters more than either balance on its own. Add up everything Julian has personally put in since he panicked at 35, 10 years at $5,800 a year, and it comes to $58,400 of his own money. Now add up everything Alex has personally put in across his full 20 years at $8 a day. It comes out to the same number, $58,400, dollar for dollar, out of 2 different men's pockets. And yet Alex is ahead by about $42,750. That gap isn't about effort, and it isn't about who sacrificed more. They put in exactly the same amount. It's entirely about when the money went in. Alex's dollars have had 20 years to compound. Julian's have only had 10. The other decade, the one Julian spent waiting for real money, is a decade. His money never got to work. There's no version of doubling down now that buys that decade back. Life at 45 otherwise looks the way it does for most people. Alex isn't rich. He's not thinking about early retirement. He's thinking about a kid's college fund or finally affording a kitchen renovation in cash instead of on a card. The account isn't the centerpiece of his life. It's just quietly sitting there in the background, a little bigger every year, mostly ignored. Julian is doing better than he was at 35. The panic bought him something at least, but the certification he couldn't afford back then is still a missing line on his resume, and the promotion that went to someone else is still someone else's job. Dave, at 45, is still working through the aftermath of the last decade. The debt is smaller than it was, but his credit score hasn't fully recovered, and the poor tax is still quietly running in the background of his insurance bill and his rent, month after month. 20 years down, 20 to go, and the gap between these three men isn't closing. Even with Julian's doubled effort, it keeps widening because compounding doesn't care how hard you try to catch up. It only cares how long your money has actually been sitting there. 20 more years pass, all three are 65. Here's where they land. Dave, $0, still working, still carrying debt. Julian, who doubled his contribution and pushed hard for 30 straight years, around $730,100. Alex, who never touched his account and never contributed more than $8 a day, around $796,500. Look closely at what actually built those numbers. Alex put in about $116,800 of his own money across 40 years, only 15% of his final balance. The rest was built by time, compounding quietly in the background the entire way. Julian put in about $175,200, roughly 50% more of his own money than Alex ever contributed, and still finished about $66,000 behind him. More effort, less result. Not because Julian did anything wrong exactly, but because he started the clock a decade late, and a decade is the one thing money can't buy back. Which brings us to the pharmacy counter. Out-of-pocket healthcare costs in retirement run, on average, around $7,500 a year. It varies a lot by person, but it's a real recurring bill almost everyone eventually faces. Here's where Alex's number comes from. Take his $796,500 balance, and instead of spending it down, withdraw just 4% of it a year. A conservative rule of thumb built specifically to preserve the underlying balance rather than draw it down. 4% of that balance is a little under $32,000 a year, generated every year without him ever touching the principal. He pays for his prescriptions without doing math in his head. He can afford a physical therapist when his knees start complaining. Dave faces the same bill with none of that behind him, which is why he's standing at that counter, deciding which of 3 prescriptions he can live without this month. Every number so far has been nominal, not real. That difference is about to matter. Remember the 3% inflation running in the background this entire time. It never stopped. It was quietly reducing what a dollar could buy every single year while the headline balance kept climbing. Here's how you actually check that. Shrink the final number by 3% for every one of the 40 years it sat there. The same way inflation shrinks it in real life year after year, compounding backward. Do that to $796,500, and its real purchasing power in today's terms comes out closer to $244,000. That's the honest version of the ending. 40 years of discipline, 40 years of ignoring the jokes, 40 years of holding steady through an actual market crash, and the result isn't a mansion or a private island. It's the difference between choosing your prescriptions and being forced to. The people who end up ahead in a story like this aren't smarter than everyone else. They just let compounding run the longest without interrupting it. And the people who end up behind usually aren't reckless. They're paying the ongoing cost of never having built a buffer in the first place. Dave is still at that counter. He picks 2 of the 3. He puts the third one back. That's the ending. Not a coffee cup, not a countdown to tomorrow morning. Just a man deciding which part of his health he can afford this month. And the quiet 40-year-long reason why his 2 friends never had to make that choice. If this was useful, the like button helps it reach someone who needs to see it. Subscribe for more of these.